No one ever asked me whether a lighthouse had any business shining this far north. It had simply been here, on the slanted basalt headland called Faros Fiel, since the closing days of the Second World War. Cargo captains muttering past Greenland liked the comfort of a familiar blink in the polar night, even if the nearest charted reef sat 60 kilometers south. When the Ice Authority offered me a solitary posting after my last rig contract went sour, I accepted without argument. A man with a drinking problem and an expired marriage seldom demands reasons. The sea at the top of the world was wide enough to drown questions. From November through February, the sun never climbed the horizon, and the lantern became the only honest star in the sky. It spun 92 times every hour, throwing its pale blade across hillocks of opal ice and fretting leads of black water. I knew each wheeze of the machinery, each breath of the paraffin flame, each groan of the cast-iron pedestal. By the fifth winter, I could tell the wind speed by the way the Fresnel lens trembled. The first irregularity was so small I blamed my eyes. While performing the midnight inspection, I noticed that each time the beam swung east, it seemed to hesitate, as though pushing against molasses, before slashing away toward the open Arctic. Standing behind the lens, I felt no mechanical drag, no stutter from the weight-driven clockwork, but the light itself dimmed, just for half a heartbeat. I wrote it in the logbook, more to humor the habit than from concern. 3 nights later, the hesitation lengthened, not by fractions, but whole seconds. The lantern's radiance looked smothered, as though an unseen hand cupped the glow. I climbed outside onto the balcony with my snow goggles and stared down at the ice field. Shapes gathered at the foot of the tower, so faint I first mistook them for shadows of the railing cast onto the snow. Yet the shadows moved against the wind, coalescing and dispersing like ink in water. I blinked until my eyeballs burned. The shapes remained. When the beam rolled over them, they withered, shrinking to puddles no thicker than a heartbeat. The moment the light glided on, they swelled again, bulging upward. One, braver or hungrier than the rest, stretched a tendril toward the gallery stairs, as though testing the air. The electric prickle that crawled up my forearms reminded me of helicopter static on the rig deck before a winter storm. I retreated indoors, slammed the bronze door, and leaned against it, while frost crept across the window glass. A rational keeper in an age of satellites and radars should have called the mainland at once. But I hesitated. If the doctor in Tromsø detected alcohol on my voice, my report would vanish into an incident folder labeled impaired. I shut off the radio and brewed black coffee instead. The next evening, I extinguished the lantern for exactly 60 seconds. Faros was not technically allowed to go dark, even during maintenance, but strict rules were a mainland luxury. I timed the experiment with a pocket chronometer and counted each second aloud, watching through the observation slit. The effect was immediate. In the pale auroral glow, I saw dozens, no, scores of silhouettes clambering over each other around the tower's footings. They were not men, nor seal nor bear. They had no symmetry, no definite edge, merely concentrations of blackness deeper than surrounding night. They writhed like knots of smoke unable to disperse. At second 55, I heard the first sound, a papery rustle, as though the ice itself was unfolding. A note so soft it felt born in the inner ear, maddening in its intimacy. I relit at second 60. The darkness disintegrated. Some fragments fled across the hummocks. Others seeped through the ice, leaving ragged holes rimed with hoarfrost. One remained pinned beneath the beam's path, quivering in agony, before evaporating like breath on glass. I stifled a shout, unwound the mechanism until my knuckles bled, ensuring the lamp would not falter again. Whatever those things were, the beacon hurt them, and it lured them. 2 sleepless days later, I combed the supply archive for any mention of prior anomalies. Half-crumbled paper manifests dating to 1947 yielded nothing except a requisition. Additional lamp oil consumption above forecast. I turned the page and found penciled under the requisition, in the hesitant cursive of a clerk, unused to speaking aloud, Keeper reports external interference, nothing more. I spent the afternoon scouring each rivet of the tower for leakage, as if light might be dripping into another dimension. By dusk, a blizzard advanced over the flow, the kind that muffles the world and turns the beam into a milky rod. I thought the storm might shield the station, so I brewed extra coffee and waited behind the reinforced glass. They came anyway. The wind parted around them like water around pylons, 10, 20, perhaps 100, their ranks impossible to count. At each revolution of the lantern, they pressed closer, flattened by the glare, only to surge back when night reclaimed them. I recalled childhood catechism lessons, describing souls in purgatory flinching from purifying fire. But nothing in Father Johansson's sermons spoke of souls without bodies. Close to dawn, I spotted two entities merged into a wobbling pillar that towered halfway to the gallery. Its apex unfurled fingery sprigs that slapped the lighthouse walls. I heard the impact through 4 stories of iron and stone. Dust sifted from the ceiling. My hands moved on their own, cranking the emergency shutters that narrowed the beam but intensified its core luminosity. The reduced sweep meant dead intervals between flashes, gaps where the base of the tower lay unshielded. Yet each time the narrowed lance struck the pillar, the creature shrieked in that same internal rustle. It too evaporated. At day's first gray smear, the survivors ebbed across the ice. I watched until none remained, then collapsed on my bunk, boots still on. Sleep smothered me like chloroform. I dreamed of drowning. No water entered my lungs, only nothingness, a textureless liquid void. In that pressureless deep I heard a baby's heartbeat, but instead of quickening, it slowed, dilating until a single lub-dub spanned minutes. When I woke, my mouth tasted of iron. I needed another witness, someone sober enough to validate the impossible. The nearest staffed station sat on icebreaker Edda, patrolling the Northern Sea route. I keyed the emergency channel and requested a Level 2 phenomenon inspection. Naval bureaucracy thrives on codes. Use the right level and men arrive with cameras before questions. The desk officer answered in clipped English. An inspection vessel, he said, could berth within 5 days if weather held. I nearly laughed. Entities of living night hammered my walls, and I got 5 days. Day 1 elapsed without incident. I nursed vain hopes they had migrated elsewhere. On day 2, a seal carcass washed onto the rocks. Every scrap of flesh was stripped. Yet not by teeth. The muscle looked desiccated, as though drained of pigment and moisture alike. I buried what was left under stones, muttering apologies. Dusk of day 3. The beacon's ballast tank cracked from metal fatigue. It was a minor fracture, the lens train still rotated, but salty steam hissed through the gauge panel. I strapped on gloves, shuffled into the service corridor, and soldered plates long enough to sustain pressure. All the while, I cursed the coincidence. A single mechanical failure would dim the beam and doom me. While testing alignments afterward, I discovered something else. The brightness drop was not uniform. Through a welding mask, I studied the core. A shadow thumbprint clung to the center of the flame, absorbing light before it left the mantle. The darkness was inside now. Panic did not arrive as one large wave, but as a creeping tide that took me while I worked. If the beacon itself became contaminated, I had no weapon left. Turning it off would invite inundation. Leaving it on would nurse the infection. I rummaged among supplies for anything photic. Halon signal flares, handheld torches, a box of disused UV tubes, even 2 strings of Christmas LEDs I had intended for the mess hall. I draped the station in multicolored halos until it looked like the gaudiest pub in Reykjavik. At polar noon dim as twilight anywhere else, the tower glowed enough to read a newspaper. Satisfied, I collapsed into the chair by the radio and plotted frequencies. Maybe heterodyne light wavelengths would confuse the entities. My rest lasted 9 minutes. The alarm bell shrieked. Clockwork had stalled. The lens froze mid-sweep. My improvised lighting remained. but the mighty beam fell silent, stuck pointing landward. I sprinted up the ladder well, 2 rungs at a time. Darkness already seeped through the observation slit, oozing across brass fittings like oil across water. It crawled into gears, clogging teeth. I kicked the release lever. Nothing moved. I threw my shoulder against the lens assembly. The glass flared, refracting my breath into rainbows. But the mechanism stayed inert. Outside, the ice field looked like a pan boiling in reverse. Bubbles of black swelling into domes, merging into rolling dunes that advanced on Pharos. Hundreds, maybe thousands now, more numerous than gulls in midsummer. Each time a lesser light from my Christmas garland struck them, they recoiled, but only the stalled main beam had true sting, and it was dying. I abandoned finesse. Pulling the emergency crank handle, I beat the iron cracked. Clock springs zinging loose sliced my knuckles, and blood spattered the glass. With a final wrench, the lens broke free. The 2-ton cylinder lurch scraped and began a slow, unguided spin upon its bearing. Imperfect, jerky, but bright. The beam, freed from the shadow plug that had nested in the dead gears, erupted outward, pure and blinding. The nearest entities blistered into ash. A shrill choir of internal rustles rose, swelling my skull. The ice bucked like a living floor as swaths of darkness evaporated faster than new masses could rise. I howled triumph into the Arctic wind. Bloody fists lifted. The victory was temporary. Minutes later, the Fresnel's unbalanced rotation ground to a halt again, this time wedged against a railing it had dented when I broke its guides. My body shook from adrenaline crash. I realized I could not keep winning little skirmishes. I required decapitation strategy. That night, between attacks, I remembered the note in the 1947 requisition book. Additional lamp oil consumption above forecast. Suppose the first keeper had faced the same siege and burned extra fuel as countermeasure. What if he also realized quantity could be turned into quality? I fetched the log of stores, still 1,000 liters of paraffin in the cistern, earmarked to last until March. I could burn it in one night, if I converted the tower into a giant Molotov. First, I drafted fail-safes, route sprinklers to vital wiring so flames would not kill radios, stack flour sacks as baffles to channel heat upward, rig the acetylene cylinders on a timed fuse for a final white-hot flare. For ignition, I would use my meteor flare gun, brighter than magnesium, nearly ultraviolet. The plan read like lunacy scribbled by a condemned man, but no other made sense. The inspection vessel was still 2 days away, assuming weather gods felt charitable. At 20 o'clock, I began flooding the lantern room, paraffin sluiced down stairwells, pooling on steel grids. I doused walls, ladders, even the note to whichever soul might someday read this. Outside, the entities battered the masonry in waves, as though tasting weakness in the tower's belly. Through cracks, I saw limbs of night reaching like kelp in unseen currents. They hated the lesser lights, but not enough to keep distance. At 22:40, the last drum was empty. I climbed to the gallery, dragging the flare pistol, and sat cross-legged beside the external beacon cowling. Wind keened along guy wires, conducting a symphony of entropy. I could not see the creatures directly beneath me, yet I sensed their hunger. It vibrated my teeth. I allowed myself one pull from the hip flask I had avoided all week. The whiskey tasted of peat and regret. I said, "Come on, then," I said, voice lost in gale. I pulled the trigger. The flare shrieked into the lantern room, ricocheted off the lens, and blossomed into a miniature sun. Liquid fire spilled down shafts like molten glass. Instantly, the tower changed from beacon to bonfire. A roar as of hurricanes erupted. Windows shattered outward. Heat slammed my face, singeing eyebrows. I flattened to the deck. From that vantage, I saw the wonder. Light, not steady, but flickering, chaotic, rippling through the paraffin vapor. Each pulse was different wavelength. A kaleidoscope strobe that no lensmaker could design. The darkness creatures buckled. Their shapes, once fluid, now warped into static geometries, cross-hatched shards that could not hold together. One by one they cracked, letting spill starry motes like negative snowflakes. Those motes winked out before hitting ground. The conflagration climbed the ventilation spine, found the attic acetylene bank, and at 2246, the lighthouse crowned itself with a second sun. White fire billowed up the Arctic night, painting the cloud ceiling electric blue. The blast knocked me sideways. Railing studs snapped, and I skidded toward the brink. Only the coil of signal cable I'd looped round my waist saved me, biting ribs as it jerked taut. I dangled like bait over the chasm while superheated air thundered past. Below, what remained of the entities fled. I use the word, though they possessed neither legs nor wings. They simply unraveled, stripped apart by light too intense for their tenuous cohesion. The ice itself gleamed transparent, revealing honeycomb voids where darkness had burrowed like worms. Minutes later, silence reclaimed Pharos. No howl, no rustle, only crackle of dying fires and the sigh of the pole of wind. The tower's skeleton glowed dull red within. Its skin flaked away, layer by layer, settling on the floe like ferrous snow. My rope groaned, threatening to burn through. I hauled myself hand over hand back to the buckled gallery. Every motion hurt. Each lungful stank of paraffin smoke. But I smiled, teeth gritty with ash. Dawn, not sunrise, for the sun was still below the world, but dawn of spirit arrived as faint citrus band on horizon. It stretched over a battlefield devoid of corpses, for things born of unlight leave no remains. All that persisted was the emptiness they once filled. At 4:03, I powered the handheld VHF from emergency cells and transmitted, "This is Pharos Light, Keeper Ivan Kessler. Structure compromised, hostile entities neutralized. Request immediate extraction. Repeat, immediate extraction." My voice cracked like a teenager's. Static answered, then a distant male. "Pharos, this is Patrol Cutter Edda. We have you 5x5. ETA 10 hours. "Bring sunglasses," I said, and ended transmission. I waited on the ice, away from the smoldering ribs of the lighthouse, wrapped in a foil blanket that gleamed silver under aurora. The world felt cleaner, as though someone had scrubbed the sky. Even starlight wore newfound sharpness. While sitting there, I realized the paradox. Destroying the beacon had saved me by unleashing more light than the lens ever could. The darkness did not loathe illumination. It loathed variety, those overlapping spectrums impossible to predict or absorb. It thrived on monotony. I wondered how many other lonely lamps worldwide served as both warning and invitation. When the Edda's searchlights hove into view, I wept, not from relief, but from the thought that somewhere, even farther north, another redundant lighthouse might still spin its narrow, perfect beam across empty waters, calling, and something would answer.